In my effort to one day have a miniature for every creature in the D&D Monster Manual, I'm printing, assembling, and painting them all, one mini at a time. And today we're taking a look at the Manticore. The Manticore truly seems to be one of these D&D creatures that has a slightly different version of its story wherever you look. With roots in real-world mythos and dozens of retellings since then, this is definitely a very setting-dependent type of monster. In some cases, they are regarded as naturally occurring beasts, but in others, they are forged monstrosities, as suggested by their D&D creature type. Its key features, of course, the body of a lion with the face of a man, is already a very disturbing visual, but include D&D's addition of wings, and this creature becomes all the more terrifying. Accompany this creature's appearance with its signature weapon of needle-like tail spikes, and you have an incredible low-level boss fight. Taking a look on my mini factory for a model for our Manticore, as is often the case with these more classic D&D creatures, there were tons of great options very close to the source material. But the one that stood out to me most was a sculpt by Bite the Bullet, one of my all-time favourite miniature sculptors that captured the disturbing nature of this beast in a pretty menacing pose. Bringing this model first into Blender, I ran it through Resin to FDM, to make these resin-style pre-supported files more capable of printing on an FDM printer. And I used Resin to FDM for this model specifically because I didn't really like its chances of printing all of these thin, delicate details using FDM tree supports, so definitely think this was the way to go. If you do want a more in-depth look at that process, video will be up in the card and down below. And for the basing rock included to base this creature, I just printed the unsupported version of this file straight on the build plate, because it really didn't have any overhangs to worry about. And then it was all over to the printer. With the Manticore all printed up, the first thing I needed to worry about, of course, was support removal and cleaning up the model. I like to start this process by snapping the brims off the bottom of the resin-style tree supports, and then removing as many as I can by hand. Which usually gets me most of the way through, then just coming in with some clippers, a knife, and some sanding files where needed. Earlier I mentioned using Resin to FDM specifically for all of these delicate parts of the model, and even using these resin-style tree supports, there were still a few that didn't survive cleanup. But now that I have removed as many of those supports as I can as delicately as possible, it's time to come in and remove some of these nubs that are left behind. On areas like this hind leg, where it's really quite noticeable where the supports were placed, I'm going to come in first with the clippers to flatten this area down, and then coming in with the knife to smooth it over and bring some of that detail back. Making sure to smooth away all of those support nubs, and even carve down the model in some areas where the overhangs might not have printed as cleanly. And just continuing this process across the model, using the flat of my knife to smooth out some of these areas, nicking off all of the support nubs, and getting this model ready for priming. And my cleanup process was definitely a lot more aggressive on the body because there was more to clean. The wings, for example, just needed a once-over with the hobby knife and a touch with the lighter, and they were good to go. Now, let's take a look at this base. Just going to superglue this down to one of my 50mm MDF discs, using a bit of superglue here, and yep, I put a bit much on and it slipped to the side, so I guess this is just where it lives now. And then using some more superglue just to attach some basic rocks to give this a bit more texture around this printed piece. And of course, now that this model is cleaned up and attached to some painting handles, it was off for priming. Today I just used some Rust-Oleum Rattlecan primer, specifically this Espresso Brown, mainly just because this is a colour that I had on hand, and I think that a nice blonde fur and dark leathery wings should build up pretty nicely from a dark brown base. And I did also hit this with a coat of matte varnish before coming in with paint, just to try and remove some of that gloss from this primer, but as we can see, it's still a little bit satin. But over top of that, I'll start coming in with some dry brushes across pretty much every part of our model. Starting of course with the body of our Manticore, coming in with some ochre yellow to start setting the midtones for this piece. And following this, we'll also come in with a dry brush on the wings. Starting with a dark pinky red to start setting some slightly more fleshy leathery tones across these parts of the model, and then doing a second dry brush layer of a slightly lighter pinky red. And I will revisit these shortly as well with yet again another lighter dry brushing, but for now let's move over to the base. This started with an initial dry brushing of a desaturated brown to pull out some of this detail, followed by a second dry brushing of a slightly warmer brown to make this look more like dirty earth. Then it was over to the rocks, continuing with our dry brushing for now with a dark grey to really set the value of this rock, and then following that up with a lighter grey dry brushing, and finally a little bit of brushwork to finish these areas off. While we're here, we might as well finish the base before moving on to our Manticore itself, using that same light grey on a brush, slightly watered down to create some more interesting texture across these parts of the model. Then we can come in and start base coating some of the other parts on our base, like these bones and skulls, using that same desaturated brown that I initially used on the base, and following it up with a slightly lighter bone colour. But I'm not going to push the highlights on these areas too far because I don't want them to compete with the Manticore itself later, so we'll just pull these up to this tone and leave them here for now. And for a couple of finishing touches to this base, some grass tufts super glued down, to make this base look more like a barren rocky hillside or mountain that this Manticore calls home. And I think that's our base pretty much ready for the Manticore. But before we move on, just want to take a moment to say that if you are interested in 3D printing for the tabletop hobby, consider checking out the Painted for Combat Patreon, where for just a couple of bucks you can get access to our awesome community Discord, pick up my printer profiles, and download all my other tools like Resin to FDM Advanced. Or at the higher STL tiers, get access not only to a welcome bundle of printable tabletop goodies, but also our monthly releases of 3D printable sculpted bases, like our release for June, the Lightning Spell bases. Cracked earth and rocky platforms that have been lifted from the ground by impressive electrical magics. These will be perfect for your spellcasting heroes, demon armies, or psyker models, and as always, these have been sculpted with flat top surfaces to eliminate those unsightly layer lines, and are designed to print completely support-free on FDM printers. So whether you want to join a like-minded community, pick up some awesome STLs, or just help support the channel, consider checking out the Painted for Combat Patreon with the links below. Right, let's get back to it. As mentioned before, we'll now come in with another layer of dry brushing on the wings, with a more desaturated flesh tone. This is just to help pull the brightness up a little bit and give us a basis for our highlights later. And while it was useful to have the model pulled apart for these initial dry brushing layers, I think now's a good time to glue everything together so we can work on the model as a whole, obviously leaving it disconnected from the base until we're finished. And even just like that, we can already start to see the direction this is going. And putting it next to the base, I think he's going to stand out nicely. Obviously, we still need to increase the brightness of the fur and maybe add some more saturation to the wings, but this is a good start. First things first, let's go ahead and block in the flesh tones across the face so that we can start to get a more full picture of what this paint job is going to look like. And this will start with some simple brushwork of a slightly more saturated flesh tone. Then we can come in with some highlights of a slightly brighter colour to start setting the values across these parts of the mini. I've recently been playing around a little bit with how I paint skin tones, and for me something that's been working really well is, like I've done here, an initial darker base coat, followed by an initial round of highlights as I've done, but then coming in with a layer of a thinned down peachy flesh speed paint. This just helps to add a little bit of additional depth and a slightly rosier colour across the skin, and sets a good foundation for adding some highlights once that's dry. While that speed paint is drying, we can start to build up our midtones and highlights on the fur. Speaking of which, for our first layers across the fur, I'm going to come in with a bone colour mixed almost 50-50 with the ochre that we used for the initial dry brush across the body. And I painted this on reasonably thin, somewhere between a layer and a glaze, in a hatching motion, and building this up over a couple of layers helps to sell the appearance of fur across the body of our creature. This is something that's a little bit harder to replicate across the tail, but painting this layer in lines down the length of the tail helps give a similar effect. And with that first fur layer done, that speed paint on the face is now dry, so I'll come back in with that same original highlight tone to re-establish some of those high points on the face. And while I'm here, I'll use some of the bone colour that's on my palette to paint in the teeth. And while we're focused on the face, a dot of brown into the eye sockets, followed by a pinpoint drop of red creates some vicious looking bestial eyes, and mixing the leftover red with some of the skin tones I already had on the palette created an easy base coat for the tongue. And now moving back to the body, I'll come in with a pure off-white bone colour to start highlighting up the fur. Again, thinning this down so that I can hatch these details on to make the appearance of fur across the model. And from here, I can turn my attention to some of the other details on this model. Starting with a black base coat across all of the needle-like spikes across this model to really help them stand out against the bright fur. And this will be replicated across all of these parts of the model, on the face, the back, and the tail. And once all of these base coats are done, I'll come in using the same dark grey and light greys that I used on the rock for our base to highlight these areas up. And of course I'm not going too bright here, I still want these to read as black or very, very dark grey, but enough that they still stand out next to the fur and other highlighted parts of our model. Looking pretty good. Alright, let's move over to the wings. To add in that boost to the saturation of the wings I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use a very thinned down Slaughter Red speed paint just to glaze over these areas and introduce some slightly richer red tones. Then I'll address the bony spikes that I forgot to paint in on the wings, using that ochre and a bone white. Back to the wings, it's time for some highlights. Coming in with some actual brushwork now, to add some highlights and details across the webbing of the wings. Using a slightly lighter neutral flesh tone to start building up the raised areas on the model, creating some slightly harsher highlights where the light would only be caught on the raised areas, and glazing in some slightly wider strips in the centre of some of these areas that would be catching more light. And while this was already looking pretty good, I wanted to come in and boost these highlights a little further, with the same colour that I used to highlight the face, just coming in and adding some additional highlights where needed to really make the wings pop. And just like that, only a few hours after pulling this mini off the printer, he was ready to take off the painting handle, scrape his feet down, and get him attached to that base. And just like that, we have another mini ready to add to my monster Manual Miniatures collection, and a Manticore ready to hit the game table.
The days spent wandering these rolling hills have left you weary, so it's no surprise you're caught off guard. A shadow looming overhead gives way to a volley of spikes that spray the ground where you stand, and looking up through the glare of the midday sun, silhouetted against the sky, a winged beast bears down on you. Its teeth-filled maw grinning as a manticore swoops down, regarding you as its next meal.
This was a really fun one, and I think from pulling it off the printer to putting it on the shelf took me all of about 5 hours, and I think for that amount of time it came out looking pretty good. It's a simple paint job, but I think that the dark leathery wings and the slightly brighter blonde fur contrast really nicely against each other, and against the more dull earthy base, that twisted human-like face reads really well. And now, finally putting this on the shelf, next to its much larger older brother, the Chimera, this Manticore feels right at home in the collection. Let me know down below what you are excited to see as we forge forward with this Monster Manual Miniatures journey. Be sure to like if you liked, subscribe down below for more FDM printing and tabletop projects, but most importantly, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a good one.